About 15 minutes later, I actually sat up and looked around. I looked at B and he was smiling. His smile stretched across his whole face. Then the weirdest thing happened to me, perhaps ever in my whole life. This really went against so many things scientifically, but it was this feeling that I could never describe. Please note that this is a pretty long story, as I'm trying to give the reader as much detail as I can, so that whoever reads this can in some way experience the trip that I went through that night. This was my first trip last summer. I have since tripped, but nothing could compare to this. I was a sophomore in high school at the time. For some reason, I had always been one to not think anything was bad. The first time I was offered weed, I was eccentric about it at a very young age, and I became a huge pothead. I started doing other drugs here and there, and I always wanted to trip, especially on acid, but neither that nor shrooms were really available for me in my area. Me and my best friend started becoming friends with this older kid in school. He said that he has tripped on shrooms many times and he could get them pretty easily. So my friend decided to buy half an ounce. This was on a Monday or a Tuesday, so every day after that, my friend, let's call him M, would ask the older kid, let's call him S, if he'd gotten them yet. And every day was the same answer, nah man, tomorrow. Finally, M got really fed up, and on Friday he told me that if he didn't have them today, he was going to ask for his money back. So here we all are, last period on a Friday, and M asks him if he's got them. S says, just go to my car after school. So M gets them, and right after school, me and M go to this kid B's shack-type place and consume about 4.5 grams each. Now these weren't your normal shrooms. These were indoor grown, white with black caps that S said were the best shrooms he'd ever had. They even tasted good. We put them on a peanut butter sandwich. It was a beautiful sunny day out as well, so we consumed them at about 3:30. Then I wanted to pick up an ounce of buds, so we walked down and met this kid at some train tracks. I gave him the money up front and he said he'd be back in 15 minutes. So now it's about half an hour since we ate them and me and M both started to feel the effects. Things started getting wavy. Me and M would just start cracking up uncontrollably. B was with us, and he would ask, "What's so funny?" And I said, "You just wouldn't understand." From this point on, I knew that mushrooms were like no other drug, and that this was going to be the best day of my life. As we were waiting for the buds, I started seeing crazy shit, things that my mind could not comprehend. I started to walk to a nearby shopping centre, because I thought I had to take a crap. I walked about 50 feet, my legs moving like jello, and realised that I simply could not make it. I also think it had to do with not parting from M, as he was the only one I would be experiencing the shrooms with, and the fact that we had both dreamed of this day for 2 years. So the kid with the buds comes back a little later. I took one look at him, and he grew horns and an evil grin. I thought he was the devil, which was weird for me, as I do not believe in any devils. Even though I saw this, I was not really worried about it. I just kind of accepted it. So, he gives me the bag, and I don't even bother looking at it. I was a little anxious about the trip and wanted to smoke a blunt, so I just felt like getting the hell out of there. He's trying to explain to me that it's really good bud, and I'm just like, good bud, yeah, cool, and stuffed it in my backpack. Then me, B and M started walking back to B's shack, and things started turning up a level. We cut across the parking lot of the shopping centre and embraced a walk of non-stop uphill, and what seemed like a 45-minute walk. We usually walk this in about 15 minutes. As we were walking, I started hearing all of these sounds in my head. Unexplainable sounds. An abundance of sounds and voices all at once, and my only option was to try to ignore it. I looked up at some of the store signs, and I was indeed seeing triple vision. So we started walking up the hill for what would seem like an eternity. The walk uphill was pretty much completely silent, even though I knew I was connecting with M, and we were both experiencing somewhat of the same thing. For most of the walk, I couldn't help but look down at the ground as I was walking, which was extremely weird by itself. But when I would muster up the energy to pick my head up and stare at the trees, it was one of the most beautiful sights I'd ever seen. I usually keep my cell phone in this little pocket of my Lee jeans, and I always have it on vibrate. I felt my phone vibrating, so I picked it up to see who it was, but no one had called. Weird. As the phone was in my hands, I felt my phone vibrate again, except it was vibrating in the pocket of my jeans. I went to pick it up, only to find that the phone was still in my hands. I figured this was just because I had felt it and was thinking about it, so it just happened again. Well, I put my phone in the opposite pocket this time, and that pocket now started to vibrate, even though I knew nobody was calling. Then both pockets started vibrating simultaneously, and pretty soon my whole bottom half of my body felt like it was on vibrate. I had no idea that mushrooms did this sort of thing to you, so I started getting real anxious to go back to the shack to kind of settle down and figure everything out. After about 45 minutes of walking, really 15 as I said, we finally made it. Now at this point, I'm seeing the hallucinations and feeling vibrations, and I'm on the brink of tripping really hard. I was more than content with the shrooms, and could not even think about smoking any weed at the time. Don't ask me why, I just wasn't in the mood. As a matter of fact, I started smoking a cigarette and could not even finish more than half of it without putting it out, even though in reality, I am a nicotine fiend. B had some leftover weed, and I had seen the weed prior to the shroom ingestion, but when he poured it out, it looked so different. It seemed as if there was more of it, double the amount, and that it had developed into an extremely light green, which it wasn't. B does not know how to roll blunts or anything, so he asked me if I could roll him one. Now I know you are probably saying no big deal, but just my state of mind and being new to the shroom trip and wanting to experience it, I'm just like, dude, I am sorry, but there is no way I can roll you a blunt right now. So he asks M to do it for him. M agrees to do it. They break up all the bud and whatnot, and then M is just staring at the blunt and at the razor blade. After about 5 long minutes, M is finally like, dude, I am sorry too. I just can't do it. It's hard to explain, but Dan, referring to me, knows what I mean. So a disappointed B just sits in a corner and watches us trip. Now, at this point, I am tripping extremely hard, probably at a level 4 out of 5 at least. It has only been around 90 to 120 minutes into it. Then my other friend P comes. We asked him if he wanted to trip with us because both me and M wanted more people to experience what we were experiencing. They would ask us what it is like, but my only reply would be, I can't explain, take them. But P declined due to an eye infection. He later said that he needed to put drops in his eye every hour, something he would not be able to do while tripping. So P finally rolls a blunt, and they start to smoke it. I asked B if I could hit it a couple of times, even though I was not in the mood for smoking the whole thing down. I hit it a couple of times. It was very relaxing, very smooth. Then I pass it to M. He says he wants to hit it, but he cannot do it, so he asked P to put the blunt to his mouth so he could hit it without holding it. I started cracking the fuck up because at the time it was just the funniest thing in the world. After my hits, I just leaned back against the wall and started having some insane closed-eye visuals, most of which I cannot remember looking back on it. From this point on, I was in my own world, an alternate universe. I remember during that time I had my eyes closed, which was pretty much the whole time I was tripping. I thought about some insane shit, as shrooms for me are more about the thinking process rather than the hallucinations. What I thought about early on is how there can be such a thing in this world that could alter your perception so much like this. It is hard to explain, but at some points during the trip, I thought to myself that it was all a dream. I would think about the power of the mushroom, and I would think about S and the fact that he is the one responsible for me seeing the world in a completely different way, perhaps for as long as I live. There was one point, I remember, opening my eyes to see what was going on around me. It mustn't have been too far into the trip because it was still kind of light outside. I opened my eyes and I was lying on the ground. I looked to my left, and M was literally upside down on his head doing almost somersaults on me with his eyes closed. I think he was tripping pretty bad. When I asked him what he was doing and if he was all right, he would just mumble to himself things like, I am so fucked up. What the fuck is going on? In a voice that kind of reminds me of what your voice would sound like when you were squeezing really hard for that turd to come out. Some weird shit. It was too much for me to handle, so I just closed my eyes again and started seeing wonderful shapes and colours. After a couple of hours into the visuals, I would imagine myself in a dream. Dream after dream after dream. I would wake up in my bed on a school morning and climb out my windowsill, which I usually do to sneak out. Then somehow I would appear at school, something would happen, and then I died. When I came back to life, the same recurring thing happened, except with a slightly different scenario attached to it. I remember at one point I scrounged up enough energy to pick my head up and look across the shack. I could barely keep my eyes open. What I forgot to mention is for the past 2 hours I somehow knew I was on a mushroom trip. But I did not remember taking the shrooms at all. The whole time I thought I was on this one roller coaster of a bad acid trip, which really was not that bad looking back on it. But you have to understand my headspace at the time. I know that plenty of people have taken acid at some point in their lives. But for some reason, while I was tripping, I thought that those people had somehow taken a fake acid or something, and that I had taken the real deal. It's hard to explain. But the real deal wasn't just an acid trip. I thought at this stage in my trip that I was literally dying because I had taken acid, and that acid is the most wonderful thing in the world for the time you are on it, falling into this never-ending black hole filled with vibrant colours and whatnot. Either two scenarios would occur. One, right after the trip, you would be dead forever, or two, this was death and what you would experience for the rest of your life. Let me rephrase what I said before. I did not think I was dying. I thought I was already dead. But somehow I snapped out of it for a few brief seconds and remembered I was with other people. So after hours of not saying one word, I shouted across the shack, "Yo, Em, are we dying?" I knew that Em was the least likely to answer my question knowledgeably, being that he was in the same state as me. But since I was on shrooms, I felt as if he was the only person I could trust. Instead of answering me back, I heard him ask B and P, "What's happening to me and Dan? Are we going to be all right?" And then B would act as if we weren't people, just things tripping or something, so he wouldn't even acknowledge us, which really pissed me off at the time. But whatever. He said to P, "It's okay, man. They're just having a bad shroom trip." Then I remembered I was tripping on shrooms and kind of relaxed a little bit and went back into my own world. About 15 minutes later, I actually sat up and looked around. I looked at B and he was smiling. His smile stretched across his whole face, exactly like that hotel clerk woman, in Fear and Loathing, if you know what I mean. Then the weirdest thing happened to me, perhaps ever in my whole life. One by one, everybody in the shack started to disappear. First, it started with B, and then with P. It was weird because I swear their bodies disappeared and it was like I saw right through them. I saw the wall and the carpet as if they were not there, but I could still hear their voices talking to me in the room. I wasn't hallucinating as if they weren't there and I thought they were. They were seriously in the room. So here we are, just me and M left. I looked down and I looked back up at M. I see everything about him except he has no head. Everything from the shoulders down. And I could see the wall behind where his head used to be too. I looked down again, then back up at him. He's no longer there. Then I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them again, I stared down at myself. I myself was now starting to disappear, and I could see the carpet so clearly from what would be under my non-existent legs. This really went against so many things scientifically, but it was this feeling that I could never describe. After my legs, my stomach started to go, and then my chest, and then my head. Then boom. At that moment I laid down again and thought I was dead once more. Each time I died, I did not remember the previous time I thought I had, so dying was a new thing every time for me. After that, I had closed-eye visuals for the rest of the trip, and did not arise until the trip was over. It was about 9 p.m. when it finally ended. Although my trip had ended, I was still extremely fucked up. As soon as I rose, I needed to share with M what I went through and wanted to know the same from him, but things got ugly. He was still tripping. He was standing up now. His eyes were closed. He was spinning around in circles, talking gibberish, and I noticed he was on his cell phone. He was calling his mom. He called his mom, asking her to pick him up because he was freaking out, and she would ask him questions and he would just say the same thing over and over. But the worst part is, after every phone call, he would call his mom right back, as if he hadn't just talked to her, and he would say the exact same things. Well, after about 15 calls, B finally took M's phone away after it was far too late. So M gets picked up within 10 minutes and I fear the worst for him. There were so many things I wanted to discuss with him. But I was alright, and still had about 5 hours left before I would have to go home, and I was in good shape. Everybody started asking me how my trip was, what it was like, what I saw, and so on. But I told them before I mentioned anything, I had to deal with a first order of business. At this point, my other friend Q is here. Q is the chillest kid ever, and I felt bad because I had the only weed in town, and it seemed as if everybody was relying on me to smoke, even though they did not say it. So I turned to P and said, "Can you roll a blunt?" Even though I knew he could. He said he could, so I busted out my weed. It turns out it really was some of the best weed I had ever seen, and I used to push a lot, so I'd been around a lot of weed. I just kept throwing in nugs to make up for what I would have smoked had I not been tripping. So I tell bits and parts of my experience while passing around the blunt, even though I was reluctant to share my experience with anyone except M for some reason. After the blunt, it kind of activated the shrooms again. Not to the point where I tripped, but it enhanced my colours so well that the whole room was in rainbow and sparkly colours. And I was seeing things like this for the rest of the night. Indeed, one of the coolest things that has ever happened to me. This was the story of my first ever mushroom trip. It was an overall extremely pleasurable experience. It turns out that this one kid that is friends with S, if you don't remember S, was the kid who gave us the shrooms, said those particular shrooms were laced with acid. I for one do not believe it. I think they were just some really good shrooms, but if I found that to be true, I would not be surprised. Thank you for reading the experiences of my first trip, and may you have many wonderful ones as well.